We're at the top of the hour, so hello everyone and welcome. My name is Henry Huntington. I'll be the moderator today. I'm in Eagle River, Alaska, and a former board member of Lutherans Restoring Creation. So very happy to be here with you all. Welcome to Voices of Faith in Climate Action, COP30 and beyond. You're probably here because you share a deep concern about caring for and keeping God's good creation for future generations. We'll hear from 6 panelists who are part of the recent UN Climate Change Conference about what took place and what it can mean for all of us going forward. First, a couple housekeeping items. First, the session is being recorded. And second, please send comments and questions through the webinar's Q&A feature. Towards the end of the hour, we will go through at least as many questions as we can, as we have time for. And if you posted them there, I'll be able to read them to the panelist or panelists in question. To start with, I'd like to have Christine Moffat give us a welcome and a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Henry. Just to set a foundation to this meeting, I want to bring a land acknowledgement. So, as we live, work, and worship in the land that is now called the United States, we recognize we do so on land that was taken from Indigenous peoples. As we are called to restore creation, we are also called to restore right relationship with one another. As we join in this holy vocation of loving our neighbor, we honor all our Indigenous siblings who have been companions of the lands, waters, and beings of Turtle Island since time immemorial. We charge our community to learn about the original and continuous stewards of the land upon which we exist. We lament legacies of violence, cultural genocide, and displacement of Indigenous communities, committing ourselves to hearing and speaking the truth of that history and its ongoing effects. May we gather faithfully in mind, body, and spirit so that we may mend what's been broken and embody Christ's gospel of abundant life.
Many thanks, Christine. Here's the format for the session. Christine will begin us, give us the start with a brief overview of COP30, telling us what that's about. After which we'll have 2 panels, and I'll introduce the panelists at the times of each of the panels. We have 3 panelists on each panel. After that, we'll have a little time for Q&A, and then we'll have a wrap up and a closing prayer, and that'll be the hour. So, Christine, would you please start us off with a basic overview of what a COP is all about and what COP30 was about in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. So, not to assume that everyone knows exactly what we're talking about when we talk about COP, but hopefully I can give a little bit of foundational understanding. So, COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It's an annual meeting where the United Nations member states convene to assess progress in dealing with climate change and make a plan for climate action within the guidelines of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You might hear people refer to this as the UNFCCC. So these have taken place every year since 1995. For reference, the decision from COP3 was something called the Kyoto Protocol, you might be familiar with, a landmark treaty which signatories first agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to prevent human interference with the natural climate. Also, a well-known outcome from COP would be the Paris Agreement, which was a result of COP21 in 2015, where participants agreed to limit the increase of global temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius while pursuing efforts to stay within 1.5 degrees. So, with that understanding, what was COP30 all about? We've been doing this, 30 years. COP30 was branded, there's always a theme, as the implementation COP. So it was focused on trying to move pledges to tangible action. This is a decade after we had the Paris Agreement. So celebrating 10 years, hoping to actually have some tangible outcomes. So it brings together, obviously, the member states. So that's like a United Nations negotiation, but you also have, on the periphery of this, you have scientists, Indigenous leaders, civil society, faith society, businesses, and industry, all gathering in Belém, Brazil, to talk about climate change in 2025, right? So the big focus of COP30 while there's many aspects to the UNFCCC and to the Paris Agreement, we often see them in tracks of mitigation, adaptation, um, and then you have loss and damage and finance and all these things that can come into play with it. But mitigation would be efforts to reduce emissions and to stop climate change. And then adaptation would be what work we're doing in order to adapt to an already changing climate. So uh, the major agreements that came out of this COP, the Belém package would be seen as kind of the landmark decision, and so 195 parties approved this, and this touches on financing, adaptation, like I just talked about, a plan for a just transition. So that's consideration of workers and how they will move out of the fossil fuel industry, gender action, and implementation. So adaptation finance, there was an agreement that they would triple the commitment to financing adaptation efforts across the world by 2035. So that would be 120 billion per year, especially focused at going to vulnerable countries coping with climate impacts. The other big focus was on just transition. So how can we help workers and communities shift to a lower carbon economy? And then we have Brazil had a specific focus on forests and forest conservation. So Brazil's Tropical Forest Forever facility was announced at COP as well. There's obviously lots of pushback that you're going to see. I think what most people would say where we fell short at COP30 was a decision or a decisive action for fossil fuels. There was a call for a roadmap for us to how we are going to move away from fossil fuels. And you had a lot of countries. I've seen it kind of painted as half and half. Half of the countries were really for this roadmap, half of the countries were against, and so therefore you didn't have a consensus agreement, which you need at these events. But an additional outcome would be that Colombia is leading the charge, and they have proposed a voluntary gathering that they are wanting to host this year in 2026 for countries that are interested in developing a roadmap. What does it look like for countries to actually decarbonize their economy? So those are the big highlights from COP30. There's plenty more to get into, which hopefully the panels will be able to dive more into that. Back to you, Henry. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
6 years of Zoom and still doing that. Thank you very much, Christina. That's a great overview. The first panel, we're going to discuss what it was like to attend COP30, and we're going to hear from three panelists: Savannah Sullivan, Lutheran World Federation Program Executive for Youth; Christine Moffat, who we just heard from, who is the ELCA Program Director for Environment and Energy Policy; and Regina Banks, who is the Director of the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in California. Each will have 5 minutes. Savannah, we'll start with you. Question for you is, we've heard that this COP in particular had a specific focus on civil society engagement. And with that in mind, can you please tell us something about your experience with that at COP30?
Yeah, thank you so much, Henry, and thanks for the invitation, colleagues, to be here to discuss with you. I think it's really important to have this conversation together. So as Henry mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about civil society engagement at COP30, and just to say this is my 6th COP in a row that I've attended together with the Lutheran World Federation delegation. And so some of my comments are going to especially be kind of comparing what I experienced at COP30 to some previous COPs for context. So Christina already said a little bit about civil society engagement at the COP, but just to say that civil society, when we say civil society, we're including leaders of NGO organizations, indigenous leaders, young people, scientists, farmers, and other stakeholders, which of course ultimately means all of us. We're all part of civil society that have a stake in the realization of climate justice and the mitigation of the impacts of climate change. The president of the Agriculture and Environment Desk of the European Economic and Social Committee, Stoyan Chokhanov, said that civil society is the driving force of accountability in the COP process. And I think it's really important to just say that civil society plays a huge role in reflecting on the ground realities to policymakers as they're having discussions in the negotiating room. Of course, civil society stakeholders bring innovative ideas, but also more and more as many of our governments are pulling back from these multinational, multilateral organizations like the United Nations. Civil society actors are maintaining relationships of multinational solidarity. And then lastly, I just wanted to say that especially our interreligious civil society leaders are keeping our ethics, our values beyond the value of profit at the center of the conversation about climate policy worldwide. So over the years, civil society's place at the COP has been effectively shrinking due to a combination of structural, political, and procedural barriers that limit our meaningful participation. That includes restricted access to negotiation rooms, speaking slots, and key information that we need to be present in the actual rooms where important decisions are made. But it also includes things like higher and higher accommodation and travel costs, reduced accreditation quotas, and discriminatory visa practices that disproportionately affect our neighbors and colleagues in the global south. So I just want to say before I talk about my experience at COP30 that this was still in part the case in the formal negotiating space in Belém at COP30. But Brazil, this COP did see a few expanded civil society engagement opportunities for a few different reasons. One is because for the past few years, the COP has been held in countries with policies that either outright or effectively ban most public teach-ins or demonstration. And for the first time in 5 years, COP30 was different. Brazil was different. There was a public demonstration allowed. You might have seen news about the climate march that included over 70,000 people that happened between the 2 weeks of COP30. But I really want to talk a little bit about some of the more formal organizing that happened on the part of civil society leaders. And there were a couple of events, too, that I want to talk about. One is the People's Summit. So for the first time, in my experience at one of these COPs, there was a formal People's Summit organized alongside the COP, which included an additional over 1,100 organizations from 62 countries. And it was especially accessible to some of those same groups that I mentioned are being disproportionately affected by the structural and procedural barriers with the UNFCCC. So it couldn't attend the negotiations, the formal negotiations at the COP, but they didn't have that same structural barrier so they could attend the People's Summit. So the People's Summit included different panel conversations, large group conversations, kind of keynotes, but also I just wanted to note a few of the things that I noticed in attendance. It focused a lot on amplifying and supporting Indigenous leadership and rights in the climate justice movement, which is, of course, something that the presidency of the COP in Brazil did also kind of highlight in their comments. But the People's Summit really included a lot of Indigenous leadership, so a lot of the keynotes, a lot of the panels focusing on Indigenous knowledge and activism that's already happening around climate justice. There's a growing conversation in civil society around militarization and war's impact on climate, especially focusing on advocacy to end the siege on Gaza, for instance, at COP30, but I think also expanding to demand that the negotiators consider things like military emissions in the ways that they count carbon emissions. And the last thing that I noticed at the People's Summit was really a deeper understanding of art being essential in climate justice communication and advocacy. You could go and see lots of different artistic media being displayed from artists from all around the world, including textile media, dance, song, painting, really a lot of kind of multidisciplinary learning opportunities at the People's Summit, which was really inspiring to me. Just to say, another note about the People's Summit was that there was a lot of teaching, especially in languages other than English, which in the formal COP negotiating area, the panels that happened there, is not usually the case. So there were a lot of events, especially in Portuguese and Spanish, given the context, but also that were accessible to speakers of other languages. This event was important for solidarity building, for inspiration and learning, and I think for me, also for really creating intercultural fluency in these conversations such that participants can push at COP30, but can also go home and advocate where they are. These relationships are really important. The second event I just wanted to mention was the Global
Savannah,
Interreligious.
we're running a little short on time.
Okay, sorry. There was also a global interreligious engagement event called the Tide PD that I can just say was a similar opportunity. And we had the opportunity to lead a Lutheran young adult leadership formation program. And so I'm happy to send information into the chat or to anyone who's interested to hear more about those learning opportunities as well.
Great. Thanks, Savannah. I wish we had more time for everybody because I think we're going to be hearing a lot of great stuff from all of you. Next up is Christine. Christine, knowing how you follow U.S. federal policy, what was it like being there without a U.S. federal presence? And how are you seeing that absence affect climate policy in the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I think it's important to note that the U.S. Historically has been involved in this process since the beginning. So as I had mentioned, this is the 30th COP. Never before has a U.S. negotiating team not been in attendance. So you may have seen that during the previous Trump administration, we were pulled out of the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement is only one portion of the UNFCCC process, and COP is broader than just the Paris Agreement. And so in the past, we had U.S. officials of, no matter what party the administration is, they attend these gatherings to either participate in the negotiations faithfully and in good spirits, or maybe they're a hindrance to progress and the process, but they always attend. They're always at the table. This was the first year that was not the case. So that means you entered the grand plenary rooms and you saw every member state's name tag and people sitting there, and the US's seat was empty. And so I think there were definitely profound moments in seeing that, just the visual of the US being absent. But I will say, when you peel back layers and you attend it, for me, Savannah has been a couple of times. You'll notice that people on these panels have been before. You're familiar with who used to sit in those seats, the negotiators that used to attend on behalf of the US. And they were still there. The faces were still there. They were wearing different badges. They were representing different organizations, but still in attendance. And so I think that is something that maybe goes a bit deeper than the headlines might read, like US is not here. I think we felt our mission as specifically as an American organization, as Americans, to attend and try to shine light onto that exact thing, that America is still involved, even if our federal government doesn't want to be here in an official capacity. And so that effort was led by organizations called America's All In and various coalitions of industry and local government, which you'll hear about, who are trying to bridge the gap. So we, as the faith community, the ELCA, we hosted an event along with some of our interfaith partners to talk about how the faith community can also bridge that gap. How can we carry the torch of the Paris Agreement, even though our government is not officially in? And I think there's a lot of ways. A lot of people probably on this webinar are doing the work that we talked about on the panel. And that's local work, that's work in your congregations, trying to move the ball forward. But I will just say the ways that we're seeing it in federal policy right now, it's not just not attending an event in Brazil that our government is pulling back from climate. Our administration is really throwing everything it can to really impede a renewable energy transition. That looks like, headlines about Venezuela and our push for oil. That looks like the EPA rolling back the endangerment finding, which is the foundational legal basis for how the EPA can regulate emissions based on a public health endangerment. That looks like wind projects being halted from the administration that were already permitted to move forward. Looks like Department of Energy report about climate that was written by climate denier scientists. So those are some examples. I think in each of those cases, you can see judges that are ruling, in favor of science and progress. So there is hope to be found. There are small wins that we've seen, and I'll just leave it with these stats that I heard the other day. It gave me a sense of hope. 99% of new energy generation that will be slated for 2026 in the United States will be renewable projects. Solar has seen a 34% increase from November 2024 to December 2025. And battery storage has seen a 49% increase in capacity during that same time. So all of that to say, the news is dark, and, the forces that be might be trying to impede progress, but it's still happening. So I think that was the message that was brought to COP30 on behalf of the US.
Thanks, Christine. It's really nice to get beyond the headlines and get into what's actually happening on the ground in many ways, large and small. Regina, now to turn to you. What unique perspective do you bring to COP, being from California, where of course we know a lot of climate-related effects are happening throughout the state? And what about this COP made that even more poignant?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Henry. Again, my name is Regina Banks. I serve as the director of the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in California, which is the state public policy office in the state of California. And this, too, is my sixth consecutive COP, getting to hang out with Savannah for a while. So a bit of institutional memory of what the COP experience is and what it has been. And just in terms of a brass tacks situation that happens at a COP, when your government is present, they have a booth, and depending on how much money they spend and how big they want that booth to be, that is the gathering place for anybody that is badged from that country to come and hang out. If you're not in a meeting, if you're not in a negotiation, you will find a member of, for example, the United States negotiations or delegation at the COP, at the US pavilion at COP. And they have back offices too, where they need to print something or have a private conversation. But if you are from any part of the United States and you want to meet and gather together, then you gather together at the US pavilion at COP. With the US not there, there was no real gathering place like that. We had the Americas All In pavilion, and that was helpful. But just in terms of having been there in the past and what was different from a visceral standpoint, it was not knowing where to go to meet the others from the United States on a campus that is the size of a very large, university and across the city of Belém. So just on a structural level, it was harder to participate in that way. But as somebody who my day-to-day work is working in subnational policy advocacy, I am saying to you, after hearing from Savannah and hearing from Christine and seeing what was on the ground in Belém, subnational governments, higher education, and faith communities are the US's last best hope for climate action. We just are. And that has probably been true for quite some time over administrations. Because of the COP structure, the Conference of Parties, only governments are parties to the action. So we overemphasize national and federal governments, but it has probably always been true that those subnational governments and those higher education, faith-based organizations, other parts of civil society have borne the brunt of whatever the commitments are that a national organization agrees to. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One, we're durable across political swings. We bring the moral commitments and daily embodied practices, and we are the ones that care for the vulnerable, whether or not the commitments are kept or not. So I will share with you that I continue to be in those conversations with some of our negotiators who, for multiple reasons, no longer work for the federal government. They work for America's All In. A lot of them work for colleges and universities in our states. They went home. They left DC and they went home. And a lot of them came back to California, but some of them went to Wisconsin and some of them went to Florida and some of them went to North Carolina or wherever home was. And now that institutional knowledge is closer than it was when they were living in Washington, DC. Amen. So that you have more access to them in that way. States maintain the emissions, most of the emission standards, right? California is the fourth largest economy on planet Earth. I've been telling people I'm right about now a lukewarm American, but a damn proud Californian. And we are maintaining the nation's highest emission standards, but other states are following suit. And if we want to be able to maintain the US's commitments to the world, we're going to have to do it in our states and in our cities. Colleges, seminaries, congregations hold the land, the buildings, the endowments, the long-term commitments that are going to outlast any administration. I'm going to come back to the moral commitments because Savannah touched on that a bit in the art and in the civil society, but to protect the most vulnerable, and we're seeing this in the headlines in ways that are not just connected to the environment, but our people who are interested in God's good creation on a host of different fronts are the carers, the professional carers, and they live at home in states. And when they are back from the front lines of in California, a fire disaster or a flood disaster, or they have personal stories of how drought affects the high desert, getting them to Sacramento to tell that story is a lot easier than getting them to Washington, D.C. to tell that story. And having the caregivers, if those most affected are not able to have that story, getting the caregivers to Sacramento or getting the caregivers to go to a county board of supervisors meeting or a city council meeting closer to home, considerably easier than getting to Washington, D.C. So if we are disheartened by what is going on, and we should lament what is happening in our name in Washington, D.C. But I think it opens the opportunities on those subnational, in those subnational rooms to have a greater impact closer to home. And I'm happy to answer questions when we come to that.
Great. Well, thank you, Regina, and thank you to all of our first panelists. We'll move along to the second panel now. We do have the Q&A coming after the second panel. Our second panel will be looking at, in the light of the U.S. pulling out of these talks, how can our churches carry forward this work? How are we doing that, and how can we continue to do that? The three panelists, we have Tracy DePasquale, Director of Lutheran Advocacy Ministry in Pennsylvania, Laura Muther, Hunger Advocacy Fellow with the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in California, and Reverend Barbara Rossing from the ELCA Church Council. Tracy, we'll start with you. How are and how can ELCA members help to further policy that is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, especially in light of the absence of the federal government? I think this builds on what we heard from the first panel. If the federal government is doing it, how can we help fill that gap?
Well, thank you. And I'm going to be reiterating some of the things that my colleague Regina just mentioned. But first, I want to say that I've been to several COPs now, and one of the best parts is the opportunity to accompany in person, to meet our global partners, and to worship with them during that week. And in Brazil, it was beautiful to be able to worship with our companions, especially the young adults who were there with Lutheran World Federation, and to listen to their stories and their grief about the flooding, the tremendous flooding that had just happened in Brazil, and the displaced thousands and thousands of people and wiped out communities. And their hope, even as they were talking to us as Americans, that yet this would be the year when the world would come together and act. And the day that I went home from, or the evening that I went home from that conversation, was to discover that my state, Pennsylvania, had finally, 4 months late, passed a budget where we did get the things that we were looking for with regard to hunger, which is, very important to us, and many other things. But the trade-off was we gave up participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And to have to return the next day and look these young adults in the eye and, meet that grief with, I felt that I had let them down. And it reminded me of my first COP, which was right after President Trump was elected the first time and announced that he was pulling the US out. And I sat with a minister from Pakistan on one of the bus rides from the center back to the secure hotel area. And we were just lamenting the lack of progress. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, they had lost 1,000 people in one province in 1 month from heat waves. And he said, just how do I respond to that? And I had headed to that COP feeling as an American that I would be met with anger, right? You're turning your back on us. But I wasn't. Over and over again, people said, we understand and we need you. We need you as the church. And so I left Brazil with that still in my ears, right? We coming back, we can't turn our backs on our global companions and our companions, in this country, frankly, who are suffering from the impacts of climate change, even if parts of our government are seeming to abandon it right now. So I am not going to get into policy particulars because every state is different and it's going to be based on your context, but to say that even though there's urgency, we are in this for the long game, right? And what needs to happen now, we can help along at the state and local level by building relationships and by building support and informing the people in our lives about climate science, its impacts, and what it's doing to people we know and love, and the world that God loves. So I'm advising show up, be informed, be known for your love, and build relationships of trust in which to share these sacred stories. And this is especially important in this age of disinformation. We can bypass people's concerns about the news, whichever angle they're coming from, when we're sharing stories. Unfortunately, some of us are sharing them from firsthand experience. I'm speaking of my colleague Regina and friends in California and friends in North Carolina, whether it be fire or flood. If you've volunteered with Lutheran Disaster Response, share the stories of what you've witnessed. If you haven't, bring in someone who has volunteered to share those stories with your congregation and your community. If you're in one of those areas that's been affected by a climate disaster, look at the map, invite yourself to speak to the church in another part of the country. And if you want to be strategic about it, look at who's sitting on what committees in Congress, or, ask your colleagues in other states about, what congregations are sitting in what districts that are key for climate policy in those states. And of course, ELCA Advocacy and our State Public Policy Office network can help you identify those areas. But let's lean into those relationships. We see that happening now with the relationships between people in Minnesota and people in Pennsylvania, where there might be disbelief from some other pathways. We are having eyes open because of relationship.
You see, I
Build on
think
relation.
we need to move along, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Really appreciate that. Again, I wish we had more time for everybody because there's a lot to say. But Laura, moving on to you, how can people of faith better frame the issue of climate change and global cooperation?
Well, first, I want to echo a few of the things that Tracy said and Savannah said. The moral aspect of framing the issue of climate change as people of faith is especially true when we consider, I was invited to think about climate change in terms of economies of care versus economies of extraction. So, economies of extraction, where we take resources from the planet and we take and we take and we take, and we have consideration just for the current moment. And this, especially as opposed to economies of care, where we are caring for people who uh, have great need for things such as their daily bread, how they will be sustained going forward when their communities are destroyed, such as the people that Tracy met. Um, this lens is present in the ELCA's environmental social statement. It addresses the need to advocate for neighbors near and far and care for marginalized communities. A quote from it is that God gives in ways that expand our notions of who us includes, from people close at hand to those around the globe. In stark contrast to those who seek unchecked accumulation and profit, our attention is drawn to those who are desperate for what will sustain their lives for just this day. And I especially have been thinking about this in terms of the global North treatment of indigenous communities with fossil fuel expansion. Since the conference was held in Brazil, I learned that they are currently violating the standard of free and informed consent, which is where indigenous communities have impact and have a say in how their land is used, especially since they have been taking care of the land they live on since time immemorial. Uh, it has been violated in favor of short-term profit and fossil fuel expansion. And one of the nicknames for this COP was the Indigenous COP. So while it was the largest presence of Indigenous people compared to other COPs, uh, again, if the rights of Indigenous people are being violated, um, change is coming much slower than needed to sustain life, especially as people from small island states, as they're called, countries surrounded by ocean, if, having more and more floods, more and more places around the world, even in the United States, having more and more fires, etc., um, that is part of why we need these economies of care. I attended a few of the California panels at COP. I attended this COP virtually. They framed climate action as benefiting our economy. And I think that is a good reason as the world for us to, for California to be involved in climate change legislation and changes. However, we need to be taking action, not just because it makes California look better than the rest of the United States. In some ways, we should be working to have these economies of care where we where to make the most marginalized, prioritize them and advocate for them because they need us to do so as not only fellow children of God, but fellow human beings.
Thank you, Laura. That was terrific. Um, I really like the tie-in across different things. This is not climate change is not happening in isolation, but is happening in connection with everything else that's going on. Um, Last panelist, Barbara Rossing. Barbara, how can the ELCA remain steadfast in our commitment to addressing climate change?
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Henry. It's so good to be on with you. Henry is a climate scientist, I'll just tell folks. So we're very honored that he's our moderator. And I wanted to go last because I think I had an experience of deep gratitude for this event that I really wanted to share and some ideas for how we can take this further in our ELCA. This was actually my third COP, but the other two I attended when I was on the executive committee of the Lutheran World Federation back in 2009 and 2010 in Copenhagen and Cancun. So this one filled me with hope because now we're after the Paris Agreement. So the key for everything now is to implement those Paris Agreement commitments. That's what we all need to be working on and figuring out ways to do that. So it was really exciting to be there.
I'll just start with a little funny thing. I was at COP the second week. I took over when Tracy went home. We had to share badges here, but a torrential rainstorm hit, and one reporter said, "Oh, it's just like the apocalyptic book of Revelation with, thunderstorm pelting things." And I, of course, disagree since I am a Bible scholar. That's not what the book of Revelation is about. But where it does fit Revelation is I think it puts us at a kind of crossroad moment, a really urgent crossroad moment. And I've got an article now coming out in the Living Lutheran magazine about this COP where I talk about that in light of the biblical text. So I'll just say that. What I want to do is just share a few slides, assuming I can get it to work, and then I'll talk about something specific I think we can do, namely participate in the ecumenical decade of climate justice action. Okay, here's the climate march. It was so exciting this Saturday there. Sorry, it's not full screen. I wanted to show this because Savannah is in this with the Lutheran World Federation group. And then indigenous groups were wonderful. This was such an exciting thing about the climate march. There were 70,000 people in the climate march. It was really great. And then the faith groups. This is the Anglicans carrying these banners with photos of martyrs, people who have been killed in the Amazon. And then the worship service, they brought these banners into the worship service at the Anglican Church. And the person I want to introduce you to, there's Regina and me on the right-hand side, is Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith from the World Council of Churches and this worship service. So I'm going to play this video, assuming it'll work here. Yeah.
Tudo está interligado, como se fôssemos um. Tudo está interligado nessa casa comum.
Allow me to bring greetings to you
Me permitam trazer saudações
from the World Council of Churches. We formally adopted by the member churches of the world the ecumenical decade of climate justice action.
Nós adotamos formalmente esse documento que é chamado a Década Ecumênica de Ação por Justiça Climática.
The World Council, yes, you may clap. Please, please.
Por favor, podem aplaudir.
I am pleased to say the World Council of Churches is always timely and relevant around the trends that happen in our world. We have had decades in solidarity with women,
Nós já tivemos décadas de solidariedade com as mulheres,
against violence,
contra a violência,
and against racism.
contra o racismo.
And now we say climate justice brings all of that together for this moment.
So that's the key, is what about this moment? And what I've been working on these last 2 months since returning is organizing. I think that's what we need to do. I've been organizing with some retired bishops and others to galvanize ELCA climate action via participating in this World Council of Churches Decade of Climate Justice Action, which started in 2025 and goes through 2034. In fact, we've written a resolution we hope you'll take to your congregation and then to your synod to support deepening action in the World Council of Churches Decade of Climate Justice Action. I've been working with a number of people on this. There's a series of whereases that sort of go through what the ELC has done so far and then resolved that urge every congregation and organization to participate more deeply. And especially then the ELCA church-wide. I've just been on the ELCA Church Council for a few months now, but I see that we really are a very democratic church, and what the national church does is what synods ask it to do. So I'm hoping you'll ask your synod to ask the church-wide office to participate in this World Council of Churches Decade of Climate Justice Action with more urgency than we have. Just to conclude, I was really impressed with Angelique Walker-Smith and with the whole World Council of Churches, as I am with the Lutheran World Federation. But the idea of a spiritual journey for this decade about prophetic witness, practical actions, and living witness, I loved it when she said the World Council of Churches is aligned with you in this great movement. We thank God for you. We look forward to the journey. And then just to echo, our presiding bishop, Yehiel Curry, did issue a statement to support the Paris climate agreements and support our church's participation. It's not too late to protect the climate. this is a kairos moment. That's a word that Jesus used in the Bible. So we need to all jump in, and hopefully the climate decade, the World Council of Churches decade, is one way for all of us to do it. And I'm happy if you want to email me about how to get copies of that resolution that you can use in your congregation. It's also on the Lutherans Restoring Creation website, along with an adult forum that I led in my congregation with Professor Jim Martin Schramm, where we introduced this idea. So we would love to work with you. And I just am so hopeful for the importance of implementing the Paris Climate Agreement, and that all of us have a role in it as God's people. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. I'd like to move on now to the Q&A section, and if I could ask all 6 of our panelists to turn on their videos again so we can see everyone as we go through this. We have a few questions, and I think if somebody knows the answer, that's great. Some may provoke a little bit more of a conversation, but we have a few practical ones. One is, what are the steps needed to get an ELCA state public policy office? Specifically in Iowa in this case, but I assume that applies to any state. So for those who've done that, what do we need to do?
The perfect person to answer that question isn't with us, and that would be the Senior Director of Worship and Society, which is the Reverend Amy Ruman. I believe maybe Karen can drop the Witness and Society email address in the chat. But there are 2 SPPOs that are on this call. We've got 4 that are fully ELCA, and we've got a whole network. So I know that there isn't one in Iowa, but there are SPPOs in quite a few of our states. So check in and see if maybe that isn't new news for you in your state.
Great. Thanks, Regina, and thanks, Karen, for putting the contact in the chat. Barbara, did you have something
No,
to?
I was just going to say, in a lot of states, as Regina said, it's ecumenical. So in Washington State, where I live, it's called the Faith Action Network, and it's with many other denominations. In Texas, it's an amazing organization, the Texas Impact Group. They were there with a video crew and everything. They're fabulous. So it's not necessarily strictly a Lutheran public policy office. It might be that there's already work going on with ecumenical partners, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll just
Right.
add, we have situations where bishops or synods have decided to fund a position, and that is a potential possibility for creating an SPPO if a bishop wants to fund that, and then they can become part of the network as well. Yeah.
We have a sort of broad question, I think, which is, how are local synods and congregations engaging now? And what opportunities do you see for our Lutheran voice moving forward? I think, you've all touched on that in one way or another in the panel discussions, but if you have anything you'd like to add.
Well, I
Tracy,
can
go ahead.
say, oh, sorry, Tracy. I'll just say Lutherans Restoring Creation is fabulous. And many synods also have an Eco Faith Action Network chapter, like the Northeast Minnesota, St. Paul area, Minneapolis area, my synod. Yours might already have one. And if you don't, you can start one. It's pretty exciting. And then you'll be with a really fun group of people who care about creation. I'll just say one other thing. On February 24th, I'm leading a webinar with Bill McKibben for Lutherans about his new book, Here Comes the Sun. So there's lots of action items. If you just look at Lutherans Restoring Creation, you'll find many.
Tracy?
If I may, as Barbara said, many synods have green teams, so you can tap into your synod green team. If you are in a state with a state public policy office, obviously you can work with them. And a big thing that we do, we will be doing something for this Earth Day Sunday that will also be interfaith, connected with an interfaith blessing of waters, and we will tie that to advocacy the next day, which is a specifically Lutheran Day of Advocacy in the Capitol. But you can do that in any state. But God's Work Our Hands Sunday, we like to call it God's Work Our Hands, Our Voices Sunday. So congregations all across the country, but we really emphasize this here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, tie their service into a learning experience, and we provide template letters that congregations can do and that are connected to the service they're doing, and then tie that to advocacy. And September is still a great time for planting trees around here and cleaning up gardens. So it's still a great time. It's season of creation. So you can tie it into creation care. And so
Great, thank you.
And
Um,
also do a bit of a plug for Interfaith Power and Light. There are quite a few synods that have a connection to their state, Interfaith Power and Light. And I believe the Central State Synod is connected with Kansas. I know that Illinois is connected with Faith in Place, which is IPL. Quite a few of the states in the Southeastern Synod are connected to their IPLs. So the ecosystem of faith of mainline Christian environmental advocacy is wide but well connected. So once you get into one, you're in the network. You're in the network, friend.
Terrific. And we have someone wondering, do other nations voice concern for environmental justice in the face of a changing climate, or is that, I can't imagine it's just limited to the US that people talk about that. So how widespread is that concern and that conversation?
It's very widespread. Most other nations voice a lot more concern than we do because, I mean, people are getting really killed by these climate disasters. In Brazil, it was so hot, it was unbelievably hot, and that's what many, many people in the world are experiencing. No, there's a lot of urgency, and most nations of the world, especially the Europeans, well, everybody, Africans, Latin Americans are far ahead of us. So we're honored to walk with others, but many nations do a lot more.
Maybe I can say, as staff of the Lutheran World Federation, that I could point you in the direction of the resources that the Lutheran World Federation has to offer. The ELCA is one of 158 member churches of the LWF in 99 countries around the world. And we consistently speak with a very strong voice about climate action, both at the global level, and those individual member churches in those 100 countries do as well as Lutherans from around the world. So there's lots of resources available for you to have theological reflections and advocacy action tools from your global Lutheran neighbors specifically, if that's interesting to you. So check out the LWF website.
Great. There's a quick question about, do we have links to events such as the February 24th one that Barbara mentioned? I think some of those are in the chat. We have the bit.ly/McKibben-call and others. So please look in the chat and you should find those there. So thank you for that question.
And Karen, can you also put in the chat the lutheransrestoringcreation.org so that people can find that model synod resolution for the World Council of Churches Decade of Climate Justice Action too?
That one's also in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you. I have a broken arm. I'm not doing very well, obviously, as you can see from my screen sharing problems.
Very, very rich chat. We have a question about acknowledging that the federal government isn't doing anything and therefore is expecting everybody else to be picking up the tab on the work that we're done. Any advice about grant funding and grant writers for helping raise some funds to work on some of these? I know it's a very broad question because there are lots of different actions that can be taken, but any experience along these lines?
Well, I can say there's grants from Blessed Tomorrow that the ELCA is a part of. There's small grants through the ELCA Hunger Program that I think could work. So yeah, I would say if don't let money be your only limiting factor. Get organized, and there are grants around. We can help point you.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and so I'll ask this one. We have a few more. I'm sorry to those whose questions we don't have time for. And this is someone who is following along with the LWF youth from Brazil who were and are leading the church's prophetic voice. And she was wondering what it's like to engage with those leaders and what the ELCA can learn from them.
I guess that question is for me. I would say I sent Karen a link, and you can check it out in the chat, a longer article about the work that we've done with LWF Youth. But Barbara was talking a lot in this decade of climate action that's coming from the WCC about the need to figure out how to like live this climate action day to day in our congregations as much as at the global level. And I would just say we had a special delegation to the COP this year that looked at these advocacy events as an opportunity to live Christian faith holistically. So young people were at panels and speaking at press conferences, attending marches and the People's Summit, but they were also writing and hosting daily devotions and really living this climate advocacy work right alongside the way that they're living their spirituality. And so I think we can learn a lot from them about creativity, cultural flexibility, and the belief that these two are really intrinsic. And I can say Christine has done a lot of work, I know, incorporating that same model into the ELCA climate program alongside ELCA Young Adult Ministry team. But I think that model really has to continue to make its way into other advocacy spaces, including congregations, synods, and other communities that are a part of our church. So if you want more information about the kind of leadership formation we do in the LWF Youth Program, you can check out the chat, and I'm really happy to answer questions. I can also leave my email.
Great. Thank you, Savannah. I'd like to say thank you to all of the panelists for being advocates with a faith foundation in these global discussions, and for energizing us for what we can continue to do in our own localities and communities. Speaking for myself, I've found this to be an inspirational conversation, hearing from all of you, all of the work that you're doing in ways near and far and large and small and so on. And I especially appreciate the optimism and hope that you bring, because it's easy to get have opposite feelings than that. So thank you all for sharing all of that. Barbara, would you please close us in prayer?
Thank you. I'll start by praying, and then I'll end with the prayer that Bishop Curry included in his statement supporting the Paris Climate Agreement as well, the 10th anniversary. Let us pray together. Holy God, beautiful Creator, we thank you that you brought us together today with you and with all your creation and all your people. Thank you for the ELCA. Thank you for the Lutheran World Federation, for the World Council of Churches, for COP30, for everyone who was there. Bless us as Jesus blessed us in the Beatitudes that we heard on Sunday. When we are poor in spirit, help us to trust that you have created a world that brings healing to all. Almighty God, give us wisdom and reverence to use the resources of nature so that no one may suffer from our abuse of them, and that generations yet to come may continue to praise you for your bounty. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Glad to see so many people coming, and thank you for the questions, and especially those we didn't have time to add, but I'm sure people would be happy to follow up if you want to track them down later and continue the conversation. If you haven't already, please consider being part of the ELCA Advocacy Network. That should be in the chat there. I don't know, Karen, if we have a QR code on the screen. There was some mention about that. If we have it, great. If not, there it is in the chat. You have all the links you need there. So with that, I think that concludes the webinar. Thank you again to the panelists and to all of you for joining in. And let's see what we can do to take this further and keep going. Thank you all.